And now I'm going to move on to our main topic, which is about it's a really important topic, an important announcement that Google has made regarding they are going to be deprecating a service, sending SMTP emails for Google emails. So this is really important if you're using Google email, Gmail, sorry, within FileMaker, and you are sending email via SMTP, that this functionality is no longer going to work. I think this is happening in September. I know Brandon's putting a link right now for a blog post that has some more details about the information in the Google announcement. So we're going to talk about some different ways that you can approach this and to keep your FileMaker solution up and running without any hiccups, and how this can be done smoothly and prepared for in advance rather than waiting until it breaks, right? So I know I've got 3 people from Portage Bay talking today. Zandon Forget is going to talk about using OAuth, Google OAuth using the Google API. And then Jacob Carr is going to talk about using the OAuth script step available from FileMaker 2023 and beyond. And then John's going to talk about an alternative approach using alternative SMTP servers. So let's see, Zandon, if you're ready, let's start with you.
And we do have a couple of blog articles talking about working with OAuth 2.0, and they're super helpful for reference. And some of the stuff I'm just going to talk about is in those actual blog articles. I'm going to post those into the comment section now, if anybody wanted to check them out. And let's see if my computer slugs down. Sometimes with my external monitor, it slugs down a bunch. But so with Google API integrations, there's there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. And Jacob is going to talk about using the built-in OAuth Google functionality in FileMaker. What I was going to go over is actually the Google API integration, not being able to use either of those. One of those generally would rely on creating a service account, and a service account is first I should preface that all of these services, whenever you're using them for email or anything along those lines, these should always be, I mean, as a security best practice, run from the server. So you should always perform these in PSOS. While testing, it's fine to use them in a local environment or use them from a remote client, but you really do want to use them always in PSOS. You don't want your traffic going out from FileMaker across the web and so on and so forth. It's better to have the server taking care of all these functions and they coming directly from the server.
Why is that, Zandon?
Well, so there's possibility for a man-in-the-middle attack from a remote client, and without having a VPN in place or some sort of a secure transmission, when it goes out, if since it's using a REST call, it's going across traffic for whatever the connection is that you're using for the REST. And if you're doing a URI call, the URI call may come back across that local port. And so definitely there's no way to tell.
When you're on an open network connection, like let's say you're at a coffee shop or even a small client where their IT infrastructure is not a completely known state, there's no way to be sure there's not a SSL decrypting proxy beast intercepting the traffic between the client and the server. And if that happens, your API keys are in the open. No, as long as you have an SSL certificate installed and your FileMaker client traffic is encrypted, then it would not apply to what Jacob's going to talk about.
Yeah. So, so the first one, is super easy to use. And that is where you're, connecting to the API, a Google API, using a service account. And the service account is pretty straightforward. You basically would go in and create a project and enable the APIs for the project. I'm assuming I'm making some assumptions that you're familiar a little bit with Google, but you would create a project, enable the APIs for the project, and create the authorization credentials and the access scopes for that. Where it gets a little difficult to just automatically think, oh, I'll just use a service account, is in regards to email with Google. And the reason why is email, the risks of it for a service account is the email is domain wide. And from what I understand, you can't lock that service account down to be a specific email account for a Google workspace. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. Being domain wide, it has access to be able to send and receive email on any of the email accounts in that domain, so on and so forth. So whereas if you do a slightly different implementation where you're using a server-side web app flow, and I go into this a little bit in the article, but on the server-side web app flow, we're basically getting permission from Google and a token at that time to access it using the individual user account. And once that's authenticated, then you can use that account to send and receive from. So it only has access to whatever account you granted it, and the permission is associated with the app. In this case, you'd be creating a FileMaker app, and then allowing whoever decides to use it would allow that FileMaker app that you created in your Google Workspace to access that information. And in that case, we're using FileMaker to do that from. So the JavaScript web app flow, it does require some additional pieces. It's going to redirect to Google for authorization, and then it needs to have a redirect URI in order to pass back the credentials that FileMaker would then use. And that piece there doesn't, you can't use the service account for it. The service account would be independent. And from what I understand, FileMaker's built in requires a service account. So those are the concerns, like I said, about the service account being that it doesn't have scope granularity for email. You have the risks of the domain-wide service accounts. It's an overload process. You can send, receive, et cetera, on all the accounts in the domain. You have audit challenges and maintenance issues with that. If you're using other API services, however, with Google, you can have different scope and access privileges per API, and those can be very restrictive. But in email in particular, it doesn't have those. So for the server-side web app flow, basically what you would end up building is you need to integrate some way in FileMaker where it's able to go out. It's able to, using insert from URL, get the request from Google, and Google provides the ability to authenticate and then sends back using that URI the token code. And so I've got an example here of how that basically works, where in this instance, we're putting in the email account name, email address, and then we would set up a project in our instance. We set it up in our workspace under Portage Bay. We created a project and associated an app that we give permissions to do different things. And you have to basically build it like you're building an application that you're going to probably sell on the Google store or something, or a web solution that you're going to sell. And in order to use it, it has to get approved by Google. So there's some other words, or you can leave it in test mode. Now, the downside to leave it in test mode is you have to manually enter any email addresses that are going to allow permission for this application to be used. And so in test mode, like we can use FileMaker, Portage Bay's workspace workspace account. We can leave it in test mode. We throw up a page that says, yes, you're going to do this and provide access. And it's, you have to have this trust with this relationship. And anytime you want to onboard somebody, you have to add them to a test account. This is a little counter to a normal web app solution where you would build the whole interface. You would send it off to Google for approval. They'd say, hey, this app meets our criteria, or it doesn't. And if it does, then they'll allow it to be fully on, anybody can use it, and give permissions for that app to do it certain things. But FileMaker, because it's kind of in a gray area between there, doesn't quite allow that. So with that, what I can show here is what that's going to look like. So in this instance where we've created the app, I've got my client ID, my client secret, my redirect URI, and the scopes that I'm going to need to have in order to send email. I can test making that connection to get the tokenization process. And so this is sort of that interface that you need to build in to FileMaker to provide this access to this Gmail account. And so in this instance, it's got some history in here for my accounts through this. So I'm going to use the labels for fun, and I'd already previously logged into labels for fun, so it's already there. But because I am using this in a test environment for my workspace account, it's letting me know that you've been given access to an app that's currently being tested, right? Okay, which this can look a little funny if you're doing it for your clients. If your clients have a workspace account, they can set this up, and anybody in the domain under the workspace account can have access. So you don't have to have this authentication. You still have to have authentication process, but it would say that it's coming from them directly and work a lot more fluid. You don't have to manually input each test account. And let me know if anybody has any questions about that. I can go into that a little bit deeper. But in this instance, because we're going to do that, I can either go back to safety or say continue. We created this. We know that we're working with Portage Bay for this, and so I'm going to hit continue. This is one where by continuing, it's going to share information, right? We're going to say yes. You can have all my information. And then here's the important one. And these are permissions and scopes that are set in when creating that account in Google. Read, compose, send, and permanently delete all your email, right? So this is a big one, right? So this now this is only for this one account, and you can control what this scope is on the account. But in a domain-wide service account, you don't have control over to compose or read or send only. It's kind of an open box. You can send, receive, and read any account in the domain. So that's why I think service accounts are a little risky in this situation where you're using Google. But if you do them in a one-off, you can control them, but there's a whole lot of hurdles you kind of have to hop through. They're not too bad, but this is one of them. So I'm going to say yes there, and I'm going to say continue. And now I've provided this Google application access to my Gmail, and it's now provided back my tokens and everything. And now I can send email using this process. So that's sort of the authentication process. And what it does right there on that screen where it popped after I said continue is it pings it. You have to enter in a URI, and a URI basically is a redirect. So you have to configure a URI in order to receive that. Some of the solutions that I've seen use for a URI, will have a web page hosted on a server, and the web page itself just has a if you basically go to it, it's automatically going to fire off the script that takes any variables that are passed to it, and it's going to file off a FileMaker script call, and then pass the parameters to that script. In that particular instance, that's one where you have risk of a man in the middle if it's running from the client to this to that server endpoint and back and forth. So if you did the Carlson Consulting, I think has, or maybe it was DB Services, had an example file. There's a couple of different ones where people have provided example files so that you can figure out this process. And it's not an overly complex process, but the URI portion of it, if you use their URI endpoint, it is bouncing off their server and then and then coming back and making a FileMaker script call in your local FileMaker file. So that's part of where the risk would be in using that. Another way to do this is where it actually sends it to a URI that is on the server, and the server processes that and in the background manages that service. Another one would be where there's a couple of different ways to handle it, but you'd be managing the URI in a different way versus just a HTML page that's being loaded. So yeah, and in regards to the Google APIs, the prerequisites for all of these are pretty much the same though, whether you're using a service account or you're using a server-side web app. You're going to end up creating a project. You enable the APIs for the project, create the authorization credentials, and then identify any access scopes. In this case, with email, you have some restrictions where if you use the service account, it's domain-wide, and that's the big one. That's the big one that stands out. Did anybody have any questions? Kind of had a lot of information in. All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, I think I can hand it back over to you, Kate.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was a good kickoff, and then we'll next head to Jacob to talk about a similar, still using OAuth, but using it within the native FileMaker script steps. So let's see, Jacob, you want to tell us your approach, and I'm sure you'll give us the steps and mention some of the pluses and minuses compared with using the approach that Zandon just reviewed.
Yeah. So I'll start with probably the documentation. Let me go ahead and share that here. So this is with the send mail step, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Oops. And I'm losing my stuff here. Okay. So we had SMTP before. Is everyone seeing my screen?
Yes, I see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then they added OAuth 2.0. This was in 20.1.1 or 23. But if we want to be version specific, there's actually some breaking changes later, but we'll get to those. So for OAuth, the process is pretty simple. I actually created a quick little checklist cheat sheet, and I'll put this link in the chat as well. Let me grab it. Actually, really good documentation from Claris, just involving setting up the Google service account portion. We heard from Zandon some of the negative concerns about service accounts that you should be aware of. They do grant, domain-wide access. So when you are creating them, like he said, every user in that domain, you essentially have access to email on their behalf, or manipulate their email. Basically, the outline for kind of incorporating this is how I would go about doing OAuth, transition from SMTP to OAuth. Usually some prep work would be, determining what number of SMTP calls you're currently performing in your solution. If any of those are via Google, obviously you're going to want to make note of those, because those would be scripts that would need to transition to the new OAuth process. It's also important to note that if you're not using 20 or version 23, then you won't even have this step, so it doesn't apply to you. And the SMTP won't, you're going to have to find an alternative solution, and that probably means you're going to be going with the API direction. Luckily, Claris has made this pretty simple. There's only 3 things that we need. Probably the most challenging part of this is doing the service account. So if you have a client that likes to do all the security permissions themselves, it may be a little bit of a process. Or if they have IT staff and this is something they're very comfortable with, this is basically an outline of how the document I just provided works in terms of creating that service account. And Claris provides us with a bunch of images to make this a little bit easier for those of us who like images. This is their blog here. You still have to enable the API. So in addition to doing the service account, you still have to enable settings for supporting the API. And in this case, it's the email API, right? Because that's what we're doing. So in this case, the 3 items that are needed for, let me go back to my notes here, are the service account email, an admin user email, and the private key. This private key is a massive key for anyone that's worked with private keys before, but this essentially gives you the keys to the kingdom for that workspace. So make sure this is in a safe place and not accessible, because once this is accessed, whoever has access to this has access to that entire workspace. So some of the things that I've kind of put as gotchas and nice to haves that I went through and kind of did this process with another client switching to OAuth. Email groups are not supported. So if they're using email groups, example would be they tied like a billing at their domain to more than one user. That's not a valid account. It's actually mapped to 2 different accounts. Therefore, it can't be used for sending email. So instead, what you would do is if you pick a default email to send from, and then the reply to would be like the group, and that's how you probably get around it. You can email on behalf of anyone assigned to the workspace. Email sent on behalf of any user show up in the user sent mail. So this is kind of a nice to have. I'm not sure in the API version, Zandon, is that true? The emails don't show up right and they're sent, or do they?
I know in Graph you could designate whether they do or don't. I don't remember in the Google one if you can designate it whether it shows up or not in the sent.
Yeah, this part I'm not sure. So that is one benefit. I mean, you're acting on behalf of that user. So anything you do with that user's email is happening in their workspace. So one of the bugs that's and maybe this is something that you guys have run into if you've tried this, but 20.3.1 fixed it. There's an authentication error. And a lot of the stuff that Shannon was showing, the URI and authentication happening, I'm assuming this is still happening. There's no clear indication from Claris as to where that the handshake is happening. So I'm not really sure on that part. But apparently during authentication, there was a break when they released the OAuth. It was in an incomplete state. So if you're still in the first version of 23 and you're only able to make SMTP or OAuth calls on your client and not on the server, it's likely because of a bug fix. that they fixed here in 20.3.1. And then OAuth obviously was added in 20.1.1. Aside from this, most of the stuff is just, filling out the send mail step. You probably have different means of supporting this. Usually it's better if you have a wrapper, then you have to change like a million places. Wrapper, I mean a script routine that essentially just calls the send mail. And that's its own purpose, right? We typically store all of the credentials and those things in, like a preferences field somewhere. And you're likely going to do the same thing here. The only difference is, probably be more mindful of how effective this private key could be for the Google Workspace. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Any questions?
One thing I wanted to point out there with that is if it's like a small company, 2 or 3 users, they're using a workspace account and they aren't concerned of it, that's probably not a big deal. If it's a bigger company, having a separate Gmail account that you're going to use to send and receive emails is probably a better way to go, because you have just that one Gmail account that you can provide a service account for, and they can't see everybody in the company. It would be on a separate domain. You'd have to possibly register a separate domain for it, but that's going to give you that like protection. So you're not opening up, because the risk is, right, if you store these credentials in your FileMaker solution, anybody who has access to this script step or that has access to these credentials could theoretically both look at, delete, view all of the email in that workspace. So that's where it's really a big security concern. But yeah, that's why I think in this instance, I would probably do a secondary Gmail account. That way it's not exposing the entire workspace, but everybody has their own business case uses. So
yeah, for ease of use, like this seems like the most direct way that they could have chosen, without actually having to, rely on separate user keys. This basically allows you to send on behalf of anybody. But yeah, there's definitely some concerns.
Hard to beat this for ease of use.
Yeah. For ease of use, it's, I'd say probably less than an hour for the change to support. Depending on how many email steps obviously you have. One thing I did think was kind of interesting that they said and I did not test this, so I don't know if it's true. But they say that you only have to change it in one location. I don't see how that's possible though. If in their documentation, they say you only have to supply the information about the sender to the OAuth one time. And we did this for another client, but I didn't test that, right? Changing it one place and then seeing if the app was still authenticated for subsequent calls. Might be something to look into.
You had a nicely designed app where the send mail script step was wrapped, and you only had to edit that one send mail script step, and you'd only have to do it in one place.
Yeah.
I know we were looking at one of a solution. I don't think we wrote it, but we were looking at one solution recently to determine the impact, and I think there were 50 plus send mail script steps.
Well, did you want to go next, John, or Kate? I guess you're mediating.
I think it's great. Let's move on to John's outside the box thinking, option 3 here, and then we can open up for discussion. And I think it would be good to, I know we've kind of touched on this, but some of the pros and cons of each solution, but I'll let John chime in now.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about some obvious stuff. you don't have to send mail through Google. This is sort of a tiny bit off topic. If the topic of this meetup is how to do stuff Google OAuth, my observation is that you don't have to send your mail through Google. There are a couple of options. If you're using one of the low cost hosting services like Blue Wave or HostGator or whoever, then you're already paying for SMTP services through your shared hosting account. So if your domain is, even if you're using Google Workspaces for email and such, you may already have a domain hosted at one of those other hosting services, and the changes to SMTP authentication that Google's doing to make Gmail more secure aren't universal. So, HostGator, as an example, if you happen to be using them for web hosting, you can still use your SMTP server there using simple SMTP authentication. Likewise, there's a bunch of services out there. SendGrid is probably the biggest one that provide SMTP mail services, and you could use them as an outgoing SMTP mail server. For most of us, the volume of mail that we're sending is pretty tiny, and so SendGrid's pretty cheap. The obvious disadvantage with those, there's two significant disadvantages to doing it that way, actually three. The trustability of that SMTP server from the internet as a whole's perspective may not be as good as Gmail. So if you send your mail through SendGrid, or if you send your mail through HostGator, your outgoing email may be a little bit more likely to be tagged as spam because those sending mail servers, SendGrid, HostGator, whatever, might not have as good a reputation as Gmail. The second one is that with the Google OAuth changes in FileMaker, or the API approach Zandon showed, your user's mail is going to show up in their sent mail folder. And if you send through a separate SMTP server, that's not going to be the case. You have to do some kind of old-fashioned trick like blind carbon copy the user's email address to get a copy of it and to save. So not as convenient. I know in some cases, we've had clients where it's simply a requirement that all outgoing emails show up in their sent mail folder. And so sending through a separate SMTP server is not a real good option there. And then probably the third potential disadvantage is if someone looks at the mail headers, it'll be obvious the mail didn't come from your domain. So if your domain is Boeing.com and you're sending through a SendGrid SMTP server, the mail's not going to show up as having been delivered by mail.boeing.com. It's going to show up having been delivered by SendGrid. So there's a slight difference in the mail headers there that may or may not matter to you, but to some people that could be an issue. So incredibly simple, because all you have to do in your script steps is just change which SMTP server you're going through. Just change the username and password in there, and your mail's continuing to be delivered, but with some potential disadvantages. So that was just the alternative option. In some cases it's a no-brainer. If you've just got some emails in your FileMaker solution and they're just sending you developer updates about something that's happening in your solution, then it's not much harm in having it go through some other SMTP server. On the other hand, if it's a CRM system and you're trying to have mail go out on behalf of salespeople, you want them to see the mail in their sent mail folder so they can keep track of stuff, and you don't necessarily want any risk to delivery happening because of spam services that are flagging SendGrid or HostGator email as spam. So that's a situation where it'd be less likely you'd want to use a third-party SMTP server. Anyway, that was my part for today, is just checking in on alternative SMTP servers. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks, John. Okay, so I think, just what I'm kind of curious about is why would somebody choose to use, let's talk about why somebody would choose to use the Google API versus, you know, the OAuth, the send mail script step with OAuth, right? So why would somebody choose to do one over the other? And I know, Zandon, you touched on security. It sounds like using the API gives you more control over security. So that could be one reason. So maybe Zandon, Jacob, if you want to throw some answers about why you would choose one over the other, that would be helpful.
I mean,
Yeah,
if you didn't have any other option, right? Application version, if you're using an older version of FileMaker is one for sure. So if you don't plan on upgrading, some people don't want to, then you won't have the steps. So you're probably going to be doing the API version.
Right. So you're not using FileMaker 2023 or greater.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
it comes down to business requirements, right? If they're a company and are okay creating a service account, then I think as a developer, you have to be really responsible and be very clear to them what the risks are. I think even in that instance, if they have control of their domain, that they can set up not a service account, but they can set up an app under their domain in the same way that we did for Portage Bay. And then they would need to, of course, configure some type of a URI endpoint to allow it to handle the authentication. But that gives them, in the same sense that at Portage Bay, we handle URI and have a server that manages the URI callback. There is a little bit of overhead to do that, but it gives the granularity and it doesn't open up the entire domain. So let's say it was a college or university, you have way too many users in that work group or workspace and that domain to risk all of that email. That there's a huge security vulnerability. Again, if it's a small group or even just one person who's running a business by themselves, then they can take on that risk and not have to worry about mitigating it. But really, making sure that I would say if you were going to communicate with the client, you really need to be sure that they understand what the implications of that, the security of that account are, being that you have basically access to their entire email ecosystem with the Surface account, and you have to be very careful about the way that you manage that access, right? So that's my big warning. I'm not usually a big security warning, but
No, I think it's especially important to look at and pay attention to. So,
and so with the use cases, it's worthwhile to consider, what's the risk? Would it be better to just create a separate Gmail account or even a separate Gmail workspace account that you can then create, have it associated with a domain, maybe not exactly your domain, but associate and have, so that it doesn't have a hand inside of your entire
right.
company.
Right.
They can send emails in an automated sense and so on and so forth. So yeah.
And that's similar to John's approach, right? Is just considering the emails you are sending from FileMaker, what domain do they actually need to be? What are their business requirements there, and what might you consider alternatives? Right. You make a sacrifice in one way, but you gain something in the other.
Yeah. And going down the lines of security again, I would make sure that all the calls are happening PSOS. You can test them in dev, and then when you want to go live, though, make sure that they're running from PSOS, because you don't know what might get intercepted from the client, whether you're making API calls or anything along those lines.
Okay, that's really good to remember. Let's see.
It's a big organizational size question, as Zandon pointed out. If you're 1 user or 10 users, you're a smallish firm, using a service account greatly simplifies it. But if you're a multi-thousand person college or Fortune 1000 company or something, the IT department's probably not going to give you a service account, so it's probably not even an option.
Right, that's a good point too.
Yeah, there's also other things, even if you do create a service account, that you want to adhere to, right, in sort of a best practice standpoint, you want to make sure and set some sort of a termination for those keys so that they have to be rolled regularly, right? You don't want to just have them out there floating. 5 years from now, somebody from the company got access to the FileMaker solution, pulled those keys out. Nobody really knew about it. A couple years later, they decided to leak them, and suddenly your entire email system is accessible. So that, there's some due diligence and responsibility that I feel like as a developer, you really need to consider and take when you're going down that sort of broad access without any sort of, it's really difficult to audit.
Yeah.
any of those types of things. Difficult to audit, and it's got difficult maintenance issues that you have to really take into consideration. So,
and I think beyond the security, there's the complexity of integrating one of these approaches. And Jacob, you said it took about an hour, to set everything up and set up that script step, right? Which is, it's one script step. And then Zandon, the approach you're talking about is going to involve a lot more than that. And so what would be, the cost benefit to having to manage complexity in the API approach versus the one step script step approach, although a little bit more than that, let's say. Yeah.
So
it also depends on how many send mail steps they're using via SMTP, and like a bunch of other factors, right, that could play into it. But
right.
Yeah, it is essentially just changing a script step.
With the API approach, there's some hidden complexity too. It's not just time to develop the API integration. It's also an ongoing support task. Maybe not a huge one, but your end users are approving the authentication for all for themselves. So we've all seen, we've all seen this happen when we've used third-party. We've used third-party software as a service systems on the web. They want access to some component of our Google account, and so we get this web dialog up that where we have to authorize that third-party app to use our Google stuff, and we're implementing that type of functionality here. And so you've got all your users who are seeing this dialog who have to potentially are going to be contacting you and saying, "Hey, is it okay that I click OK to this?" So you've got a little bit of an ongoing support issue associated with the API approach. And we have to have that hosted URI page that is letting the users do that authentication. So you've got a web server where you've stuck this URI stuff that is a dependency that's complicating your environment a little bit as well. So the API approach does have, absolutely, is more secure. And in some cases, it's mandatory because of IT requirements or FileMaker version, but it is a more complex approach.
I wanted to make sure we have time for questions as well. And I know we just had one. Steve Moore asked if using Microsoft OAuth are all those security concerns that Zandon mentioned for Google OAuth, I think, still relevant, I think. Yep. What you're asking. So
it's the same in Microsoft's, if you use a Microsoft service account. I think that you have a little bit more granular control in Microsoft. I haven't played because I don't have access to, like, we have Google Workspace account, and we've worked with the clients who have managed, their IT department has managed configuring the Microsoft account. For granular control, I'm not sure if it allows for a deeper granular control. I believe it still has the same service account process. I just don't know if you can control, like, the service account only has access to these emails, so on and so forth. From what I'd seen, it was a domain-wide service account in the same fashion. So same security concerns. And then you would use Microsoft's OAuth for approval.
So I did definitely want to throw it open if people have more questions, and also make this a discussion about anybody that may have any other insights or other approaches that they're using to handle this, this change from Google. Would love to hear other people's insights as well. So feel free to jump in or send in a message if you wish.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if anybody feels like we stated anything wrong or we're missing something, let us know too, because it's only through sharing information that we learn like better practices and how to do things better and smarter ways to do things. So